Hello, I'm glad you have been able to join us for this webinar, and welcome. I'm Roger Firman from the UK Association for Accessible Formats and delighted to be joined by our guest for this month, Jess Mills, a UKAAF board member. Jeff, very warm welcome. Could you tell us about how you became interested and involved in technology and how that led more specifically to your interest in technology for disabled people? Where did it all begin?
Hi, Roger. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, interesting question. I suppose I've always been a little bit of a geek. Even when I was at school, just growing up, I was a bit of a geek, but that wasn't where my profession first took me. I actually landed a job as an apprentice lithographic printer. So I was doing wet print for some time and did a whole bunch of jobs around that. And then I started working for the Southern Water Authority at the time. And well, this is a long time ago now because I'm quite old. But I saw that they started doing things which are called electronic printing, which I didn't really know too much about, but I realized that I was kind of interested in it. It means I could kind of use some of my programming skills and stuff I was interested in. So I shuffled my chair over to this thing called electronic printing and realized there was this great way of doing individualized one-to-one communications with people that I'd never even thought of before. So when you get your statement or your bill through your post, it's, you know, obviously got information on there that's very personal to you, and then you can do marketing messages that are personalized as well. So I started doing programming for this electronic printing stuff, and I did that for quite a few years. And technology progressed and became more and more complicated and more refined in some ways. And then one of the companies I was working for had a really large finance company that it worked for that came to them and said, one of our directors is blind and can't read the statements we're producing. They were producing PDF statements and putting them online by then. Is there anything we can do about that? And we said, well, let's look at this. We don't really know. Let's see what we can do. And we realized that there was this thing called PDF UA, user accessible PDF, and this could solve a lot of problems back in the time. And these large print streams were created in a PostScript, and so we had to translate that into PDF on the fly and create this user accessible PDF that could be read by screen readers. And we learned a lot by doing that. And these was creating millions of documents at a time as well. And when we did that to start with, there was a lot of other companies that came on board asking us to do the same thing. So I kind of wrapped my head around actually what does this all mean. And that's really my move from technology, and how I got into accessible technology was directly through customer pushing us. I say it was a very large finance company, and since then we've worked for many more large finance companies and telecommunication companies, and really anyone that creates those large documents en masse.
Yes, fascinating, isn't it, how these things begin?
Right.
Obviously, since then you then came to a realization that you wanted to do something yourself, and you've created Grackle. And just before you tell us about the development of that journey, I wonder if we could listen to something. Jeff, perhaps you could explain, and then, as it were, take us on the journey of how it came into being, and explain for anyone unfamiliar about Grackle and how it works, whether you could talk us through the steps. So I know there's quite a lot in that, but
There is, but yeah, let's go for the Grackle first.
yeah.
That was, for anyone who doesn't know, and I didn't know at the time, that is what a Grackle sounds like, and it's a very chattery North American bird. They flock together and they chatter like that in their thousands, and it depends on what part of America you're into, whether you think they're a blight or you love them being around. But no matter where they are, and there's different types of grackles like there are with most different birds, they just are very communicative and make lots of noise. And so when we were coming up with a name for this thing that we were trying to build at the time, we wanted something that was kind of, it sounded a bit more like motion, and grackle sounds a bit like a verb. To grackle, something's grackling. In fact, most of our advertising is written about get grackling now, and so it was kind of it had a nice sound to it. It had a nice musical note to the word grackle. And then we realized actually the bird itself was pretty good because it's kind of something that's talkative, and we like the communication side of grackle, so that worked really well as well. And then because we were working exclusively on Google products, kind of Grackle and Google go quite well together. So yeah, it's just kind of all mixed together. And I'd love to say I took credit from this, but it wasn't. It was our chairman that came up with that name back in, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And as soon as he came up with the name, it was like, yeah, that's the one. So we went with it. So that's how Grackle came about as a name. And then the reason for us creating Grackle as a company was that my business partner and I, who had worked on these high volume accessible documents for many years before, had both left the company we worked for and gone our own ways, but kept in touch because we'd known each other for so long now. I mean, it's well over 20 years, and we were good friends. And even though he lives in Toronto and I live south of London, we were in contact constantly. And sharing ideas and wondering where the rest of our lives will take us, and just generally in contact. And in fact, a little story in that as well is that we met up on holiday. Me, him, and our wives all met up on holiday, which is where Grackle was truly born. And I'm not too ashamed to say that we'd had a few too many drinks at the time, thinking we should start our own business, where all the best ideas come from. And then when that settled down, and the next morning in the cold light of day, I said, actually, there is something that we can really do to help out here. And we both used Google Docs at the time to communicate with each other and kind of share ideas. And it was great. Google Docs is great because we can both write on the same document at the same time. We can both edit in real time while we're on the phone to each other. It was just a really handy way for us to work. But what we realized was that Google had worked really hard on the front end of Google Docs alone at the time, is all we were looking at. But the back end was still the Wild West. People can create a document, as with most editors, and throw it out the door without even thinking about where it might end up, whether it's going to someone who does need assistance with the reading of the document or not. And so we thought, well, there must be a way that we can help, align the back end to the good work that Google have been doing on the front end, and at the same time try and democratize accessibility. The work we've been doing before was very specialist work for large corporates that cost lots of money. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time for us to work through and make that all work for them. And we thought, well, we'd been on and held lots of training courses on accessibility by that point as well, because we knew a lot about accessible documents. And the one thing about training is that people forget very quickly. As we do with all training, we sit within a classroom for an hour and we're told a bunch of stuff. And you walk away and you've got your notes and you may remember it for a couple of days, but time kind of kills it off. And we thought what we don't want to do is just create training programs for Google Docs. That's really not going to work very well, I don't think, for anyone. And also, Google update their software so often, we'd be forever renewing what we're writing. So we thought, is there a way that we can electronically or programmatically sit on a Google Doc and assist people as they're writing their document? And that way, any user can sit there and be helped to make something as accessible as possible. So there's a couple of things when we first started designing the software. Is one, it had to be extremely easy to use. And I've told my mum, so I'm not speaking out of turn here, I said, look, Mum, if I know that you can use it, I'm probably in a good space, because she's not very technical. And she was okay with that. So that was our kind of guidance point, was if you can use it, then I think we're in a good place. And the other side was obviously to try and make it as affordable as we possibly can, and to be easily spread as it possibly can. So there's a few kind of defining points when we first started building this. And we took about a year, I think, to start with. to really get the first prototypes underway and working. And now it's been running for 5 or 6 years. We have now made over 5 million documents accessible around the world. We have something like 160 site licenses, mainly in North America, but we do now have a dozen or so in Europe and growing steadily. And so the way that it works is it's an add-on to either Google Docs, Sheets, or Slides. And anyone can go to the Google Workspace marketplace and download them for free. And as soon as they're added into your Google Workspace environment, you have the ability to activate that add-on whenever you have a document open. And when you activate the Grackle add-on, a panel comes up on the right-hand side of your document that actually walks you through things that are accessible or inaccessible with that document. Now, the interesting thing with that part was, to what standard are we making this accessible or inaccessible? And that was an interesting point in itself, because a Google Doc is really like an HTML-ish type document, even though it's proprietary. So what are we doing here? Are we going to go to WCAG standards? Which is, yes, we did. There are a lot of WCAG standards in our add-on. But also we realized that people may not want to share Google Docs at the back end. They may want to go to an alternative output, such as PDF. And we chose PDF mainly because it's relatively ubiquitous in the world. Love it or hate it, it is out there. And when built to a good standard, it works quite well. So we decided to not only try and make your Google Doc, Sheet, or Slide as accessible as possible, but try and make the same for a PDF output. So we created a PDF exporter built into the Grackle output as well. So the standards it looks through are a mixture of WCAG standards and PDF standards, and PDF UA standards in particular. So I think at the moment we're at, is it 22 checks for Google Docs that we run as soon as you have the add-on running, and it'll take you through how to do tables and how to do headings and look at your color contrast and kind of a multitude of things that are there. And that's where we've got to the point now of being used around the world and quite heavily. Once we created Docs and that started to run, we realized actually the first place to focus on distribution of this was within the education system, to make sure that we could help student, staff, any type of faculty to actually create documents that are easily distributed. We felt that there was one place where documents are often sent and then you're never quite sure where they're going to end up. It's easy if it's just sent to a pupil that's in your room, that's okay. But quite often these things go home to a bunch of guardians, whoever they might be, and you don't know if they need help or not. So it seemed like a good way for us to get there. And going back to democratizing this, we started distributing that with a kind of a non-profit mentality. So we now have hundreds of these installed, again, mainly in North America, but some in Europe as well, with really a non-profit in mind. It's extremely cheap to buy en masse. And so as a for instance, for $950 for the year, you can have everyone within your institution use it. And so we have people like New York University has 75,000 users. It's still $950 for the year. So that's really just covering costs. Mm-hmm. So we did that to start with, and then everyone started asking about the rest of Google Workspace, which is Sheets and Slides. So the spreadsheets that they're creating and the presentations they're creating. And spreadsheets probably hasn't been so heavily downloaded, although we do get people that are very serious about the spreadsheets, which is good. But Slides has become extremely prolific in the way people are using it, because slides are created by everybody. They're sent out to everybody. They can be very complicated, whereas a normal document can be quite structured. A presentation is normally quite random. For example, if you create 3 text boxes on a page in a presentation, the way that Google looks at that is the first box that you create is the first one that will be read. Now, I never create a presentation that way. I normally throw text boxes on a page and I move them around and I kind of add things and I go back things. how on earth do I make sure that they're ordered in the right way? Well, you can do that really easily with Grackle now. You can say, right, that box is number 1, that box is number 2, this is number 3. It doesn't matter where they're positioned on the page. The logical page and the physical page can be quite different. And that's been extremely helpful, I think, throughout the education system. And then latterly, I suppose that the way that it's now gone into is that we're now crossing over into the commercial world. So we've got some really good commercial customers. We've got some really big commercial customers as well. They're actually taking this seriously. So it's kind of been that real nice end-to-end process of creating something you hope will help, and kind of a bit of fun to start with almost, and then you realize you can see it in action and really helping out. So that's how it works.
Fantastic. There's obviously a huge amount in making all this happen, and you've obviously got something really interesting going on there. And I'm just wondering, has it ever proved difficult to keep Grackle up to date with developments of the underlying software?
Yeah, it is. It's one of those things. Google are a very big company doing lots and lots of things all the time, and sometimes you're not told that something's happened within the underlying software. So everything we do is based on Google Workspace. We sit on top of that. So any changes that are going on in there, we just have to make sure that we are on top of. And sometimes I feel as though we do a really good job of that, and other times not so good. And not always for Google's fault for not telling us, but sometimes we just miss things. But luckily we have such a good user base now that are almost like our quality assurance testers that are using it every day come back and say, oh, do you realize this thing is broken or this thing is broken? So we do get really good feedback like that. The most frustrating thing, I think, is trying to make sure that the front end remains accessible, as well as all the documents we're creating on the back end. Keeping the front end accessible has proven more problematic because of the changes that are made to the interface that Google put out there. So that's a constant battle for us. And one of the things we have generally on the roadmap for this year is to get better at keeping on top of that. So yeah, they're the two things. Is one thing is making sure that you keep up with the things on the front end that Google have done, and then make sure that the lovely stuff they put that you can do in the back end, we can still represent or correct easily.
Yes, excellent. I can imagine it must be times of frustration and difficulty, but somehow you get through it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, you're definitely kept honest by your users, which is good.
Well, it's good that you get that feedback, because then it can, as you said, it can alert you to things that you might not know about, and that's sometimes, I guess, will be easily corrected, and other times not so easily. So
no, absolutely.
Is there any link between Grackle and, say, Epub, for instance? I mean, do those?
Yeah, interestingly, yes. So as you know, we both know Richard Orme from Daisy very well, and the Epub standards, and we've worked with Daisy a little bit over the last couple of years. It wasn't a standard that we set out to be a company or accompany our product with, but having spoken to Richard at length about this, the good thing is he's using Grackle before creating Epub from Google Workspace, which anyone can do. If you do run through the Grackle add-on to start with, you'll get to something like 95 to 98% of the way there without us really doing anything on the back end at all. So we don't, at the moment we don't anyway, we don't adjust the Epub output directly that Google create, but we do still go through a lot of the steps that make the Epub more accessible to start with. So there's been a kind of nice sideline in knowing that helps on that side as well. I think it's one of those things with enough time, money, and effort, there are so many other ways that we would like to help as well. We would love to make sure that with the Google Workspace, you can download so many different formats like Epub or even Microsoft, a competing standard, and we could do such a much better job of creating all of that output in a really accessible way. So our roadmap is a never-ending and never shortening process of things that we could add. But Epub is definitely one of those things. I'd love to get those last couple of percentage points just to know that you get it over the line and it's fully accessible.
Yes, because there are just so, even from where I sit, now obviously there are just so many developments going on the whole time, and it's how you can either be ahead or not too far behind in the catch-up process, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. Anyone who has a software company realizes that you generally are a few steps behind. It's just, even though it's the nature of it. I mean, I think your roadmap, your true roadmap, probably is a few steps ahead. But by the time things come through and you truly understand it, and you then have the time, effort, or money to develop it, by that time you are just a little bit behind. So it is one of those kind of never-ending games, I suppose.
Do you have any feeling of where software might be going in the immediate future? I mean, obviously there are new versions of Windows. We told at one time there weren't going to be any, and then these things come out, and new packages emerge, I guess, and
yeah, there's so much going on as well. You're right, and if I had that crystal ball, I'd have bought Microsoft back in the 70s, I think, and it would all been great. But I think there will be a lot of development on kind of AI versions to help accessibility. We can see from the skunk works that go on in the back of Google, there's certainly work on certain things, but there's only so far that AI will take us in our lifetimes, I think, on that. But to answer where Grackle sees that future being, we don't see ourselves moving outside of the Google space. We think Google Workspace will continue to expand. It's now in something like 80% of all education institutes in North America. There are over 6 million business users around the world that are paying for Google. Everyone thinks that Google is kind of this free thing that everyone uses, but there's a lot of businesses paying a lot of money into using Google Workspace. And at the moment, we can just see that expansion. They're changing their document formats to be a little bit more easily used across browsers, across machines, and shareable. So we did a lot of testing to make sure that anything we're doing will still work with the new Canvas standards that they came up with, and that all works well. But I think the other thing I think that will jump forward a little bit is the reader technology. Reader technology now can be, as you probably know, Roger, using different readers can come up with different results. And I think that reader technology will take a little bit more of a jump over the next few years too, to assist with the documents that are being created. So I think it's with accessibility in mind, and the way things are going to move forward, it's going to still be a mixture of the technology partners we use, but also we do need to educate people. It's still going to be a people-driven process that helps this forward rather than a truly technology one.
Yes, and I think finally I'll just be interested to know what was your way really into UKAAF? Was UKAAF something you knew about, or were you introduced by other people to it, or was it something that crossed your path because you were doing so much work with accessibility and formats and things like that?
It crossed my path and it was way back when we first started Grackle. I think until then I hadn't heard of UKAAF, and then I started working with the PDF Association and the groups around the PDF Association, and I'm trying to think of the first immediate contact with UKAAF, and then I realized that there was something out there, whereas up until then I didn't realize there was something out there to help people and start thinking about these standards in a deeper way. And so it was absolutely through the creation of Grackle and just being on the circuit a little bit more, seeing what was out there. And then the conversation with UKAAF came about with, well, is there anything I can do to help there? But that was a few years back now.
Yes, I know. Certainly 2017, I think you were.
Oh, there you go.
Opted onto
so about the year after Grackle, the year after Grackle started. There you go. So it was. We were still working out how, where, what, why Grackle is, and what it might do. And I think, well, in fact, I think by 2017 we probably had like 20, 25 customers using it, and it was kind of in its rudimentary form. They were they were a great boon to us, the early customers, because they just gave us so much feedback, positive feedback. Constructive criticism is great, and you need it over and over again. And those first customers really helped us on our way, and to get more of a user understanding. I think one of the eye-opening things back then was, having been around accessible documents for so often, I took so much for granted that people would inherently know. And well, of course, when you're talking about the general public, that's not true. 99% of people don't generally know this stuff unless they're told. And they weren't told at that time. So things that we put in place within the software that we thought, well, people just understand. We very quickly realized that people don't just understand. You have to make it a little bit more obvious or tell them. So that development phase was extremely steep.
Yes, fantastic. At this point, Claire, I'm wondering if we have any questions.
We do. Do you feel that providers of electronic documents are becoming more aware of material in accessible formats?
Of material in accessible formats? I think so. I mean, if you look at the things that they're doing, I mean, Google with their Skunk Works are certainly looking into these things, and the things that Microsoft have added into their accessibility output, and they're kind of, they feel good and bad sometimes, a bit like trying to describe images. So I think they realize that something's been added in here, so let's look at what that is and try and analyze it in some way and give some feedback on it. I do think there's still a long way to go, that we could really help the users more, and that's from a from a Grackle point of view as well, is that we could be way more informative of helping people understand the material that's put in there, and the feedback on that. I know there's a grading process in the States, and the name of it has escaped me for now, that even goes down to analyzing paragraphs of text to see what user group it's aimed at. And I think for accessibility, moving beyond visual impairment, but into general accessibility of understanding, that stuff's amazing, that we can now, from an AI point of view, go through paragraphs of information and give feedback that this paragraph was written for a university professor, or this was written for someone who's 10 years old. So you can give feedback to the user that maybe you want to adjust the way that you're writing this so that it's more accessible to the end user. I think all that stuff's really interesting. So the short answer is yes, I think they are more aware, and there are offices within each of these companies that are specifically looking at accessibility and how to make it better. I think that those of us that have been around it for so long just wish it was way bigger and way quicker.
Yeah. Thank you. Claire, any others?
Yes. What kind of feedback have you received since the launch of Grackle?
Oh, so much. 5 or 6 years, and still getting that. We've had some lovely feedback in the fact that there were so many, if we look at our customers that have specifically bought and have been customers for many years, it was down to individual use cases. Like we had one customer, it was specifically their school menus were being put online, and they were just making them in a Google Doc, and as they could post it onto their website so everyone could see. And I think it was either 3 or 4 people that just could not read this thing because it was in a kind of a weird table format that Google doesn't really do very well. And so those kind of the feedback where you realize that now those specific documents are helping people at the back end are really good. And then other use cases which are far bigger, where you get universities or schools or school districts that have had large lawsuits brought against them, and they truly had no way or no understanding of how they could correct the things they were doing wrong. Because it was so wide and vast, you got hundreds of people creating thousands of documents, and how do we correct this and still conform, to knowing that you've helped them get through that, and that all the people they're sending those documents to can now see those are great. And then on the negative side, we've had many, and we still get them now, about go back to the usability of the front end, because we're always playing catch up to make sure that's usable. We've got some works at the moment to try and make that better, but it is a non-stop process. But yeah, I think on the whole, over the last 5 or 6 years, it's been extremely positive, and we have like 100% referenceability through our customers, and a testimonials page on the website. And I think the testimonials page is pretty much every customer we have has said something nice, which just kind of just feels good. It makes us feel good that people say nice things.
Yeah, of course, and where it's, as you said earlier, where it's constructive and helpful, it's moving everything on. It's clear you've made a huge impact, and that there's room for many more people to use Grackle. So before closing, I'd like to thank Claire and Emma, who've been helping behind the scenes to make this webinar possible. There will be another one on the 3rd of May, but don't ask me what the subject's going to be, because I don't know. We will have something, but I'm waiting to hear on 1 or 2 things. So we will keep in touch with you. So finally, leaves me to thank you, Jeff, for your most interesting and informative discussion. I'm sure we've learned so much from you this afternoon, and we all wish you well in your future developments. And I would encourage all of us, if we haven't explored Grackle, let's do it. Let's see how it can be used in many and diverse situations and incorporate into our work. So Jeff, many thanks indeed.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So from us all, until next time, goodbye.